I'd been driving for hours, hoping the endless stretch of road would help me clear my mind. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and as dusk began to settle, a hazy mist crept over the road. My thoughts drifted back to my recent life upheaval, leaving my teaching job, my breakup with David, and the persistent, empty feeling that had driven me to start fresh. I told myself that this road trip was just the beginning of that. I barely noticed the first warning signs. A faint sputter, a slight jerk in the wheel, and then, nothing. Silence. My car rolled to a slow stop on the narrow road. I tried the ignition once, twice, but it was useless. The engine was dead. Great, I thought, glancing around. I was in the middle of nowhere, no signal on my phone, no landmarks except a faintly glowing light up ahead. At this point, I didn't have much of a choice. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, locked up, and started walking toward the light. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a light, it was a small, quaint town, nestled into the trees like something out of a postcard. The buildings looked old but well kept, with cobbled streets winding around neat little shops and homes. A modest, illuminated sign at the edge of the road read, "Welcome to Arbor Hills." I'd never heard of it, and a quick mental map check didn't offer any answers. Still, the sight was a relief, and I picked up my pace, eager to find help. The town square was eerily quiet as I made my way to what looked like a diner. The neon sign flickered, casting a warm glow over the empty street. Inside, a few people were seated, talking in low voices. A bell jingled as I pushed open the door, and the chatter stopped. Every eye turned toward me. "Evening, miss. You look like you've had a rough night," said a man from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. His smile was friendly, but his gaze was sharp, as though he'd known I was coming. "Car trouble," I replied, managing a smile. "I broke down a mile or so out. Do you have a mechanic around here?" The man nodded, his smile widening just a little too much. "Oh, sure thing. Our mechanic will be here first thing in the morning. You can stay at the local inn tonight." He turned to a young woman sitting by the counter. "Annie, why don't you show her to the inn?" Annie gave me a nod, her expression warm but unreadable. She looked to be about my age, but there was something strangely familiar about her face that I couldn't quite place. I brushed it off as road fatigue and followed her outside. The inn was a quaint little place just around the corner, with ivy creeping up its old brick walls and an old-fashioned lantern glowing by the entrance. Annie led me inside and handed me a room key, not bothering with the usual check-in formalities. I thanked her, but she lingered a moment, looking at me with that same peculiar expression. "You're passing through?" she asked, almost as if she were disappointed. "Yeah. Just passing through," I replied, hoping to ease her concern. "I'll be gone first thing." She nodded, though her eyes flickered with something I couldn't read. "People don't pass through Arbor Hills often." "Not anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange, but before I could ask what she meant, she gave me a slight nod and walked back down the hall, leaving me alone. I found my room, an old-fashioned space with a small bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the empty street. As I lay there, the silence was almost oppressive, as though the town itself were holding its breath. Outside, the faint glow of street lamps barely cut through the darkness. I felt that something was watching me, that the walls around me were alive with secrets. Just as I began to drift off, a noise jolted me awake, a soft creak, like a door opening and closing in the hallway. I sat up, heart pounding, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Cautiously, I got up and peered into the hallway. It was empty. Just nerves, I told myself. You're alone in a strange town, it's normal to feel on edge. I closed the door, locked it this time, and lay back down. But sleep didn't come easily. A question lingered in my mind, an itch I couldn't scratch. Why did this town feel so familiar? I woke to soft sunlight filtering through the old, lace curtains. For a brief moment, I'd forgotten where I was. The events of last night felt hazy, like a half-remembered dream. But as I looked around at the quaint, old-fashioned room, the strange little town, Arbor Hills, came back to me. My car. I had to figure out what was wrong with it and get back on the road. After a quick splash of water on my face, I made my way downstairs. The inn's common room was empty, save for Annie, the woman who had shown me to my room. She stood near the entrance, hands clasped, as if she'd been waiting for me. "Good morning," she greeted, her tone friendly yet oddly formal. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," I replied. "You mentioned a mechanic would be available this morning." She nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Mr. Hughes. His shop is just down the street. He'll take care of you." I thanked her and made my way out into the crisp morning air. The streets of Arbor Hills were almost unsettlingly quiet. A few people were scattered about, going about their routines, but they barely glanced at me. It was as if I were invisible, or maybe, as though they were trying not to acknowledge me. At the mechanic's shop, an older man with weathered hands and a kindly face greeted me. He introduced himself as Mr. Hughes and listened attentively as I described my car troubles. He promised to take a look and suggested I make myself at home while he worked. The word struck me as odd. Make myself at home? I was only passing through. I took a slow walk around the town square, taking in the details. Everything looked pristine, but there was a strange, unsettling quality to it, like a movie set where the actors had gone missing. Even the shops seemed frozen in time, with window displays that could have been lifted from a 1950s postcard. As I wandered, I noticed a building that looked like a library. The sign out front was chipped, and the windows were dusty, but the door was open. I stepped inside, half expecting it to be deserted, but a middle-aged woman sat at the front desk, flipping through an old book. She looked up, eyes widening as if she'd seen a ghost. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. "Just browsing," I replied, offering a smile to put her at ease. "My car broke down, so I'm here for a bit." Her eyes softened with something that looked like sympathy. "I see. Well, feel free to look around. Most visitors don't stay long." I was beginning to sense a theme. Everyone seemed to hint that people came to Arbor Hills but didn't stay, or maybe they couldn't. I tried to shake off the feeling and walked down an aisle, letting my fingers brush against the rows of worn spines. Halfway through the aisle, I noticed a single book that looked newer than the others, a leather-bound journal with no title. I pulled it off the shelf and opened it, skimming through the pages. Inside were entries that felt like diary entries but written by different people. The names were unfamiliar, yet as I read, something about their words made me uneasy. August 12th, they've been asking about me. I don't know why, but they know things they shouldn't. September 3rd, I'm forgetting things. Little details, pieces of who I am. They keep looking at me as if I belong to them. October 19th, I can't leave. The roads, they keep leading back. A chill crept down my spine as I read the last line. I was about to close the book when a voice behind me said, "Interesting, isn't it?" I jumped, turning to see a woman standing nearby. She was around my age, with messy brown hair and wary eyes. She looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," she said, managing a faint smile. "Name's Alice. You must be the new visitor." Something in her tone set me on edge. "I suppose I am. My car broke down outside of town." Alice nodded, her expression grim. "That's how it starts for most of us." "Most of you?" I repeated, trying to make sense of her words. She glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening, then motioned for me to follow her to a quieter corner of the library. Lowering her voice, she continued, "You're not the first one to end up here, Laura. People come, usually by accident. But once they're here," she paused, her gaze darkening. They don't leave. My heart pounded as I tried to wrap my mind around what she was saying. What are you talking about? It's just a town. She shook her head, almost pityingly. That's what I thought too, at first. Until I tried leaving. Why can't people leave? She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder again before replying, they need us, Laura. The townspeople. They know things about us, personal things, memories we never shared with anyone. And once you're here, they absorb you. Bit by bit. You start to forget who you are, until you become one of them. That's impossible, I whispered, but even as I said it, I felt a strange, hollow dread settle in my stomach. Think back, she insisted. Do you remember how you got here? I mean, really remember? I tried, but my memories of the drive felt foggy, like something was missing. All I could recall was the stretch of road, the mist, and then, this place. Before I could answer, a shadow fell over us. I turned to see Mayor Hensley standing in the doorway of the library, watching us with an unsettlingly calm smile. Good to see you're making friends, Laura, he said in a voice that sounded perfectly normal, yet carried a thinly veiled warning. Alice, why don't you show her around town? Make her feel welcome. Alice's face drained of color, but she forced a smile. Of course, Mayor. As he left, Alice grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in just enough to make me wince. She whispered, meet me tonight. Midnight. The woods behind the inn. We have to talk. Before I could respond, she released my arm, nodding toward the exit as if we'd been having a pleasant chat. I nodded, playing along, but my mind was spinning. A part of me wanted to leave, to forget this conversation and brush it off as small-town paranoia. But another part, a deeper, instinctual part, knew something was very wrong here. As I walked back toward the inn, my thoughts raced. Who were these people, really? And more importantly, what did they want from me? The sun had long dipped below the horizon, casting the town into a murky twilight. As I walked back to the inn, the quiet streets of Arbor Hills felt ominous, as though they were watching me, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that every window hid a pair of eyes, observing my every step. Inside the inn, I pretended to settle in for the night, but my mind was on Alice's cryptic warning. When midnight finally came, I slipped out of bed, threw on a jacket, and made my way downstairs as quietly as I could. The hallway was silent, save for the soft ticking of an old grandfather clock. Its hands crept past midnight, each tick a countdown to something unknown. I slipped outside, breathing in the cold, damp air, and headed toward the woods behind the inn. My footsteps crunched on the dry leaves, the sound eerily loud in the stillness. Just as I began to question if Alice would even show, a figure emerged from the shadows, Alice, her face tight with urgency. Did anyone see you? She asked, scanning the area around us. No, I whispered, glancing over my shoulder, feeling an instinctive fear. Are we really in that much danger? She let out a humorless laugh. If you knew what this town was capable of, you wouldn't have to ask. They don't let people leave once they're here, Laura. But why? I asked, desperate for answers. Why keep people here? What do they want from us? Alice's gaze darkened, and for a moment, she seemed to struggle with how much to reveal. This town isn't just a place, Laura. It's more like a trap. The people here are bound to it. Over the years, they've become like empty shells, their own identities lost. So they take the memories of people who end up here, people like us. They need our lives, our experiences, to survive. I felt a chill settle deep in my bones. That's insane. I thought so too, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Until I started forgetting things, small things at first. My favorite childhood book, the name of my first pet. Then it was bigger things. Eventually, I couldn't even remember how I got here. The longer you stay, the more they take from you, The memory of the journal in the library came rushing back, with entries that seemed to echo exactly what Alice was saying. So how do we get out? I asked, fear edging into my voice. Alice's face tightened with determination. There's a way. Or at least, I think there is. I found a map of the town hidden in the library basement a few years ago. It's old, centuries old, but it shows a path out of Arbor Hills. The problem is, I can't remember where I hid it. My frustration boiled over. You don't remember? Alice, if this map is our only chance. Do you think I don't know that? She snapped, her voice breaking. The more I try to remember, the more it slips away. I think the town does it on purpose, to keep us from finding a way out. She took a deep, shuddering breath, then continued, there's only one place I haven't checked yet. The old church on the outskirts of town. No one goes there. I think the townsfolk are afraid of it, or maybe it's off limits. But I need someone to go with me, and, she looked at me, desperation in her eyes. You're the only person here who's still whole. Her words weighed heavily, but I knew I couldn't ignore her. Fine, I agreed. I'll go with you. But we go tonight. I don't want to wait another day in this place. We started walking, moving cautiously through the quiet streets. The church stood on a small hill at the edge of town, silhouetted against the dark sky. The closer we got, the more I felt an oppressive weight settle over me, like the air itself was thickening. The wooden doors creaked as we pushed them open, revealing a musty, darkened sanctuary. Moonlight streamed through broken stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the dusty pews. Alice moved with purpose, leading me toward the back of the church. If the map is here, it's likely hidden somewhere no one would think to look. I just need you to keep watch while I search. I nodded, casting wary glances around the shadowed corners of the church. Every creak, every gust of wind, made my heart race. I tried to keep calm, but the air felt charged, like something was waiting in the darkness. Alice crouched near the altar, her fingers running along the edges of a loose floorboard. She pried it open and let out a soft gasp. Here, she whispered, pulling out a small, leather-bound book with a worn, folded map tucked inside. She spread the map open, her eyes scanning the faded ink. This shows a route, a tunnel, I think, leading out of town. If we can follow it, we might be able to escape. But before we could celebrate, the sound of footsteps echoed through the church. Both of us froze, the hair on the back of my neck prickling as Mayor Hensley's voice drifted toward us from the doorway. Ladies, he drawled, his tone smooth but cold. What are you doing out here at this hour? Alice shoved the map into her coat pocket, stepping protectively in front of me. Just praying, Mayor, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. The mayor took a step closer, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. Is that so? You know, Alice, I had hoped you'd learned your lesson the last time you tried to leave. His gaze shifted to me, and a thin smile crossed his face. And you, Laura, such a shame you don't trust our hospitality. My heart raced as I realized the extent of his knowledge. He had been watching us, tracking every move. This whole town had been keeping tabs, waiting to catch us trying to escape. Alice squared her shoulders, defiance sparking in her eyes. You can't keep us here forever, Hensley. We know what you're doing. He sighed, his expression one of feigned sympathy. If only that were true. But it's for your own good, you know. There's no place for people like us outside of Arbor Hills. Before I could react, Alice grabbed my hand, her grip firm. Run, she hissed, pulling me toward a side door as the mayor's calm demeanor cracked, his eyes widening in anger. We bolted through the side entrance, sprinting across the fields beyond the church. The wind whipped through my hair as we plunged into the woods, guided only by the faint moonlight and the rustling leaves. Behind us, I could hear the shouts of townsfolk, footsteps crashing through the underbrush as they followed, relentless and determined. As we ran, Alice kept glancing over her shoulder, her face twisted with fear. If we can just reach the tunnel, she panted, we might stand a chance. The woods grew denser, the trees closing in around us like dark sentinels. Every step took us deeper into the unknown, but I clung to Alice's words, desperate to believe we could outrun whatever haunted this town. Ahead, through a break in the trees, I glimpsed the faint outline of a rock face with a narrow entrance at its base, the tunnel from the map. My heart leapt with hope as we stumbled toward it, the sounds of our pursuers fading behind us. But as we reached the entrance, Alice pulled me to a stop, her face pale. "Once we're in, there's no turning back," she whispered. "Then let's go," I replied, squeezing her hand and taking a final look over my shoulder at the shadowed figures lurking at the forest's edge. Together, we stepped into the tunnel, the darkness swallowing us whole. The tunnel was pitch black, the only sound our shallow, hurried breaths echoing against the cold stone walls. The faint light from the entrance behind us quickly faded, and I clutched Alice's hand tighter as we moved deeper into the darkness. Our footsteps were cautious, feeling our way along the uneven ground. Every few steps, Alice would pause, shining a weak flashlight she'd pulled from her pocket onto the map, whispering directions to keep us on track. "This map's old," she murmured, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It might not be accurate. But if we follow the markings, we should end up past the town's boundary." I didn't respond, the weight of her words settling heavily in my mind. There was no guarantee this path would lead us out, but it was our only hope. Outside, we'd seen the shadows of townsfolk gathering by the entrance, their eyes glinting with an unnatural intensity. They hadn't followed us inside, but the thought of them waiting for our return sent chills through me. We kept moving, the air growing colder as we ventured deeper. The tunnel was narrow, just wide enough for us to pass single file. Claustrophobia crept up on me, the oppressive weight of the earth above pressing down. It felt like the town was still watching, still waiting, as though Arbor Hills extended its control even here. "Laura, stop," Alice whispered, snapping me out of my spiraling thoughts. I froze, listening intently. Faintly, I heard it, a slow, rhythmic dripping sound. Alice turned her flashlight toward the source, revealing a small pool of water in a recess of the tunnel wall. The water shimmered, reflecting fragments of light in an unnatural way, almost as if it were alive. "Don't touch it," Alice cautioned, stepping around the pool. "The last time I tried to escape, I encountered things in here. I think they're part of the town. Manifestations of it." "What do you mean?" I whispered, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Alice's gaze was dark, her face etched with memories she clearly wished to forget. "This town doesn't just trap people, Laura. It consumes them. If you stay too long, it's like you become part of it. Pieces of people who tried to escape before, memories, even physical remnants, they're scattered here." The implication was horrifying. I didn't dare look too closely at the walls or the floor, terrified I might see something I recognized, something human. We continued in silence, every step taking us deeper into the unknown. As we walked, I noticed an odd change in the air, a faint smell like damp earth mixed with something metallic. It grew stronger as we went, turning my stomach with each breath. Then, up ahead, the narrow tunnel widened, opening into a cavernous space. Alice hesitated, her flashlight casting eerie shadows against the stone walls, revealing faint carvings etched into the rock. "What is this place?" I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. "An old meeting spot, maybe. I think this town was built around some kind of cult, a group of people who believed they could preserve themselves forever by absorbing the lives of others," Alice replied, barely louder than a whisper. "I think that's what happened to the townsfolk. They're trapped by their own ritual, living through the memories they steal from people like us." As I stared at the carvings, shapes began to take form, figures intertwined, strange symbols, and scenes of what looked like rituals performed in a dark, circular room. In the center was an engraving of an eye, watching over the other figures. The eye's gaze seemed to pierce through the stone, locking onto mine. "Laura, we have to keep moving," Alice urged, pulling me away from the carvings. But before I could turn, I noticed something carved beneath the eye, a faint outline of the town itself, with lines extending outward like roots. Each line ended with a small circle. As I traced my fingers along the map, a chilling realization hit me. Each circle marked a path leading out of the town, but every one of them ended abruptly, except the line leading to the tunnel we were in. "It's like a web," I whispered. "A trap." "That's exactly what it is," Alice replied. "But we're on the only path that might lead out." We pressed on, the tunnel narrowing again as we left the cavern. The air grew colder, the metallic scent intensifying. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to focus. I wasn't sure how long we had been walking, but exhaustion was creeping in. Then, suddenly, Alice halted, her flashlight beam fixed on something up ahead. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what she was seeing, and my breath caught in my throat. There, in the dim light, was a figure standing still as stone. It was a woman, her face frozen in an expression of horror. Her eyes were wide, staring directly at us, yet unseeing. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Alice's hand gripped my arm tightly. "It's one of the lost. People who tried to escape but became part of the town. They're echoes, like shadows left behind." My skin crawled as we stepped past the figure, and I couldn't tear my gaze from her frozen form. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her hands outstretched as though reaching for help. I stumbled, breaking eye contact, and forced myself to keep moving. As we walked on, we passed more of them, silent figures, each frozen mid-motion, each one bearing an expression of terror. Men, women, even a child, all of them trapped in this eternal purgatory, neither alive nor dead. Alice's voice was barely a whisper. "They're reminders of what happens to those who don't make it out." A chill settled over me, a fear more profound than anything I'd ever felt. This town had stolen their lives, their memories, and left these remnants to haunt the tunnel. Finally, up ahead, I saw a faint glimmer of light. My heart leapt, it had to be the tunnel's exit. I glanced at Alice, her expression one of cautious hope as she quickened her pace. We reached the end of the tunnel, emerging into the open air, and the sheer relief was overwhelming. But as I took in our surroundings, my heart sank. We stood on the outskirts of the town, but something was wrong. Everything looked different. The buildings were faded, almost translucent, as if they were phantoms. Shadows moved behind the windows, figures that resembled the townsfolk, but they were distorted, hollow. "This isn't real," I whispered. "It's a reflection, an echo of the town." Alice looked around, fear etched into her face. "It's not just a town, Laura. It's alive. The town itself is feeding on us." As the realization dawned, I felt a presence behind me, a shadow, tall and oppressive. I turned slowly, heart pounding, to find Mayor Hensley standing there, his face twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can't escape, Laura," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of finality. "Arbor Hills doesn't just hold people, it becomes them. And soon, you will belong to it." I stumbled back, panic surging through me. But Alice grabbed my hand, her face fierce with determination. "Run, Laura. Keep running. Don't look back." We turned, sprinting away from the ghostly image of Arbor Hills, the mayor's laughter echoing in our ears. My lungs burned, my heart pounded, but I didn't dare stop. The world around us blurred, reality shifting and warping, as though the town itself were trying to draw us back. And just as I felt myself slipping, as my memories began to blur and fade, I heard Alice's voice cutting through the darkness. "Remember who you are, Laura. Remember." With every ounce of strength I had left, I held on to her words, focusing on the fragments of my life, the school where I'd taught, my family, my name. I held on to them with a desperation I'd never known, refusing to let the town take them. Then, with a sudden jolt, the world snapped back into focus. We stumbled out of the woods, gasping for breath, the oppressive weight of Arbor Hills lifting from my chest. We were free. Or at least, we thought we were. Alice and I stumbled forward, finally breaking free of the forest. We could see the main road just beyond the tree line, a faint glimmer of light in the early dawn. For a moment, pure relief washed over me. We had made it. We were out. But as I looked around, a strange feeling lingered in the pit of my stomach. The world outside Arbor Hills felt different. I couldn't tell if it was exhaustion, or if the town had left something behind, but everything felt just slightly out of place. The trees looked darker, the air colder, and even the colors around us seemed muted. Alice looked over at me, her face etched with exhaustion, yet her eyes sparkled with a new hope. "We're free, Laura. We really did it." I nodded, clutching my own arms against the cold, unable to shake the feeling that something was still wrong. But I forced a smile, too drained to question it any further. "Come on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's find some help." We walked toward the road, and as the first cars passed, I felt a strange sense of disconnection, like I was watching my own life from afar. A car eventually stopped for us, a kind driver who agreed to take us to the nearest town. But as he drove, I found myself unable to answer his questions, each one tugging at memories that felt just out of reach. When we finally reached the safety of a motel in the next town over, Alice and I collapsed onto our beds, the adrenaline of our escape finally giving way to exhaustion. But even as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind began to drift, the memories of Arbor Hills gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Alice jumped, glancing at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yes," I whispered back, barely able to breathe. For a moment, we both stared at the door, waiting, our bodies tense. But there was nothing. Just silence. Alice let out a shaky breath and lay back down, muttering, "Just nerves. The town left its mark, that's all. We'll be okay." I wanted to believe her, to brush off the feeling of something lurking just out of sight. But as the days passed, that feeling only grew stronger. I started to forget small things, a favorite childhood memory, the name of a pet I'd had as a child. Every time I tried to recall details of my life, they felt hazy, like memories of someone else's life. One night, as I lay awake, struggling to hold on to the fragments of my past, a chilling realization settled over me: the town hadn't just let us go. It had taken something with it. In the following weeks, Alice and I stayed in contact, but both of us grew increasingly distant. She mentioned experiencing the same strange memory lapses, the same moments of unreality. It was as though Arbor Hills had left an indelible mark on us, a parting gift that ensured we would never fully escape. One afternoon, after a few days without hearing from her, I decided to visit Alice at her new apartment. But when I arrived, I was greeted by a stranger, a young woman with a distant, hollow expression who claimed she had never met anyone named Alice. Desperately, I showed her photos and emails, trying to prove that Alice existed, that she was real. But it was no use. Alice had vanished, her existence slipping away like a forgotten memory. My heart raced as I left the apartment, dread clawing at my chest. I called the motel we'd stayed at, hoping for any trace of our time together, but the clerk had no record of us. It was as though Arbor Hills had never let go, its influence reaching into the very fabric of our lives, erasing every trace of our escape. A few days later, I began noticing other odd occurrences: neighbors I didn't recognize waving at me, strangers smiling as if they knew me intimately. And each time I looked in the mirror, I saw a face that was both familiar and foreign, a version of myself that seemed to shift, becoming someone I didn't recognize. One night, as I walked down a deserted street, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, to see a shadowy figure standing in the distance. The figure took a step closer, and though I couldn't make out the face, I felt a strange sense of recognition. The figure raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave, and in that moment, a flood of memories returned, memories of Arbor Hills, the endless maze of streets, the hollow-eyed townsfolk, and the oppressive weight of the town itself, pressing down on me like a living entity. I tried to look away, to break free, but it was too late. The memories tightened their grip, erasing everything else until only one thought remained. I belonged to Arbor Hills. And Arbor Hills was never going to let me go.